Just a second. Could you ask the question in the break? Welcome everyone to the last and the final lecture. This topic is, I spent almost 10 years of my life on this topic, and I'm very passionate about this. Oil and economic development in Nigeria. First of all, why study this topic? The first answer, because your lecturer tends to like it. The second answer is that lots of countries in sub-Saharan Africa are rich in natural resources like oil, diamond, gold, uranium. So it's important to know the effect of these natural resources on economic development of these countries. Now, in the first glance, you think that countries that are rich in natural resources should be advantaged for economic development. Why? Because they could sell those natural resources like oil and get a lot of foreign exchange in return and invest that foreign exchange in physical capital and human capital. So there should be advantage. However, during the last 2 decades, many scholars are believing exactly the opposite. They think that the fact that you have natural resources like oil is actually a disadvantage. It's a curse for economic development. Now, why Nigeria? Because Nigeria is considered as a typical example of a country that has been cursed by natural resources. A typical example of an oil-cursed country. A country with a lot of opportunities and resources, but a lot of wasted opportunities. So Nigeria is in a way being cursed by oil. Now let me give you a little bit of background about Nigeria. Oil was first discovered in 1956 the country gained its independence in 1960. You had a civil war in 1967. Then, of course, after a lot of social instability, it's the best opportunity for the generals to stage a military coup and gain power. So you had the rise of military dictatorship in 1970, and then in 2000, the transition to democracy. Today, Nigeria has 170 million people. It's considered as a low middle income country, and it has the 10th largest oil reserves on the planet. However, despite all these resources, Nigeria have done not very good in terms of economic growth. This graph shows you the income per capita of Nigeria between 1970 and 2006. Considering 1970 as 100 as a benchmark, you see until 1980s you have lots of ups and downs. So if it goes up, that means that you have economic growth, the income is increasing. If it goes down, that means that you're having a negative growth. Income is actually falling. As you can see, you have a drastic fall in income per capita during the 80s, and even in the 2003, income per capita has not been able to recover where it was in the 1970s. It is still below 1970s. This is a tragedy. Given the enormous resources of the country, this is a tragedy. This shows you the poverty head count, the percentage of people. Sorry, it's actually the absolute number. It's the absolute number of people in poverty, below $1 a day. And you can see an increase between 1970 to 2000 from 20 million to about 80 million people. Increase of fourfold of the total number of people in poverty. Now this connects to our lecture about demography, if you remember. During all these decades, African economies had a high population growth rate. Why? Any idea? Why African countries had a higher population growth rate than other countries? Yes, Giovanni?
Because of a high fertility rate.
Yeah, exactly. Much higher fertility rate. During these periods, the fertility rate in sub-Saharan African countries were around 5 or 4, while in other countries was about 3 or 2. Now, let me show you with the gapminder the extent of failure of Nigeria. This shows you the life expectancy and income per capita. As you can see, Nigeria was richer than South Korea in 1958. Income per capita 3,000, here income per capita 1,000. Nigeria was 3 times richer than the average South Korean. Life expectancy, however, in South Korea was higher. Now, let's see what happens to the income per capita of the two countries. Ready? Ready? Okay. An amazing divergence. Nigeria today is as rich as South Korea in 1975. Today, 2015, as rich as 1975. So in a way, it gives you about 40 years. Nigeria is 40 years behind South Korea in terms of income per capita. A drastic story of divergence. Given that this is interesting, South Korea was poor in natural resources. They didn't have a lot of natural resources, while Nigeria had a lot of oil during all these eras. So the other side of the natural resource curse is that if you don't have a lot of resources, maybe you do better. We have many, lots of growth stories of the 20th century, especially in East Asia, have been countries that have been resource poor. Any questions? No? Okay. Now let's continue. Another graph. Now South Korea is usually considered as the remarkable story. Okay? Let's now compare Nigeria with much more average countries. Vietnam, for instance. Philippines. Even if we compare that, we still see the tragedy of Nigeria. Nigeria being way richer than Philippines and Vietnam. And then today, these countries started with much lower income base. And Vietnam has the same income per capita, while Philippines is actually richer. So why? Many believes that because Nigeria is having oil, is cursed by oil. Now let's look at the evidence about the resource curse in general, not just Nigeria. What about other countries? Can we see the similar trend at the big level, that as you become richer in terms of having natural resources, you have a lower growth rate? So in other words, resource-poor countries have a higher growth rate than resource-rich countries. Now, this graph try to capture this relationship. On the x-axis, you have the export of natural resources in percentage of GDP. What does this tell you? Yes, Christine?
There is a negative relation between the number of exports and the reality of people.
Let's hold on to that. What about this? What this axis tells you?
The countries are rich in natural resources.
Yeah, if you increase this, if you come from here to this, that means that you're richer in natural resources. This is for the year 1970s, the starting point. Now this graph shows you, for instance, in 1970s, Kuwait was way richer than other countries in terms of having natural resources. This shows you the graph, the economic growth afterwards, between 1970 until 1990. So richness at the beginning, economic performance afterwards. So we see a negative relationship between them. Resource-poor countries have a higher rate of growth. Resource-rich countries have a lower rate of growth. Roughly a negative relationship. Any idea of the first developing economists who came up with this relationship and popularized it? Any idea? Sorry? No. He is one of the main advocates, but one person before him. No. Who is the most famous development economist? Let me give you a hint. He goes out with Angelina Jolie in Africa, and he is treated as a celebrity. He hangs out with politicians, with Bono. Jeffrey Sachs, thank you. Jeffrey Sachs. That's his picture with Bono. One of the most powerful development economists. He is actually the face of Millennium Development Goal. And he's the first person that came up with this idea. Remember, this is about geography. This time, not having bad geography, actually having good geography. A lot of natural resources is bad for economics, but it's still geography. A very technical view, a very deterministic view of the world. Now, after he found this relationship, people tried to explain why. The main question is that, okay, we found the evidence, but we need to explain why is it that richer countries tend to have a lower rate of growth. Now, before moving out, let me again give you another piece of evidence at the general level. This is the income, median income, almost something like average. I expect you to know the difference between the median and the average. But it gives you an idea about the income per capita. This is in constant $95. As we would expect, resource-poor countries usually have a lower rate of income because they don't have a lot of resources. Now, resource-rich countries usually start at a higher income because they can sell a lot of natural resources and gain money. However, in the long term, this is the short-term story. In the long term, we see that resource-poor countries has overtaken resource-rich countries. Another evidence for the resource curse. Now, let's go to see why. Why we have this negative relationship. In today's lecture, we're going to cover two kinds of explanations. First, economic explanations. People saw it as an economic phenomenon. Natural resources ruins your economy directly. And they came up with 4 different explanations for that. All of them are economic. How natural resources can ruin your economy directly. We call these economic explanations. Then in the second half of the lecture, I'm going to talk about the political explanation. So it's important that you always keep in mind the difference between these two. Economic explanations and political explanations. Any questions so far? Let's start with the first one, volatility challenge. The main problem of natural resources, and in particular oil, is that their prices are so volatile. You just need to follow the news during the last year. What has been happening to the oil prices? A lot of volatility. What is the stake today of oil prices? Anybody following the news? Nikita?
I think it's below $40 per barrel.
Any idea why?
They said that OPEC wasn't able to decrease their production rates.
Mm-hmm. Was not, or was able? Was not. Was not. Okay. You see, this is not a new story. It has been going through centuries. Lately, the oil prices have dropped, as Nikita mentioned. In the span of less than 1 year. Dropped from about $90 to about $40. In the span of 15 months, the oil prices dropped by more than half, from $90 to $40. Now, why oil prices or any other commodities like gold, like coffee, like diamonds, why the prices are so volatile? Any idea? I would be impressed if someone is able to answer that. Jacob?
They're not differentiated products.
They're not differentiated. So,
The producer doesn't have the ability to change the price of it at their will.
the producer have not so,
Their price tag isn't.
then we should expect a stability. Why not?
Because anyone can come into the market.
Anyone can come into the market. Okay. No, that's... Yes?
Is it because the producers can't suddenly halt production and also the consumers, they can't suddenly just change how much they consume? It happens over time?
Exactly. And we call that
Yes.
inelastic demand and inelastic supply. Very good. Christine, yes?
Yeah.
Very good. Let's look at the both sides. So it's about fundamental demand and supply, classic economics. You have inelastic demand for commodities, basically. If the oil prices rise or go down, you don't have a lot of substitute for oil. You don't change your consumption. So the demand is not flexible. Let's look at the supply side, okay? The supply side is not flexible either. You know, if the price of oil goes up or goes down, as a producer, you cannot immediately respond. So what is the overall effect of this? A small change, either in the demand or the supply side, can lead to a large swing in oil prices. I'll repeat that. When you have an inelastic demand and an elastic supply, a small change in either side can result in a large swing in prices. Another explanation. So this is classic demand and supply. Anyone coming up with another explanation? It's very, very fashionable in SOAS. Yeah.
Is it because it's closely tied to politics?
Closely tied to politics. Good. Could you give an example?
OPEC in the 70s doing an embargo on the U.S.
Very good. Very good. Why did they do an embargo on the U.S.?
Was it because of Israel? Israel?
Yeah, Yom Kippur War. Exactly. So Saudi Arabia is a large producer. It has a lot of power on the supply side. And in the end of the day, they're a state. They're not business. They don't want to maximize profits. So sometimes they want to use their resources for political purposes. You know, we increase the price of oil, you know, to increase pressure on Israelis' ally to change their behavior. Very good. So sometimes remember that oil producers are states, and states have political ambitions, and this can make things very unstable. Finally, financialization. You know, globalization. When you let financial industry to bet on everything, including the commodities, you gain a lot of volatility. You know, financial industry bets about the prices of wheat, about the prices of oil, about the prices of anything that you can think of. And this creates speculation, a lot of hoarding behavior. Now, let's go back to the more important thing. Why volatility is bad for your economy? I need to explain this by giving some examples. Let's assume that you're an oil-rich country. Okay, all the oil revenues goes to the states because the oil industry is nationalized. The price of oil in a year goes up by 40%. Okay, oil price. Your revenue goes up, let's say, by 25%, the government revenue, fiscal revenue. Now you decide to spend this revenue. Newfound money. So the spending goes up, public spending goes up by 25%. Now, this has a big effect on aggregate demand in the economy. The aggregate demand in the economy increases by 15%. Why? Because the government is a big actor, and if a big consumer, if the government increases its consumption by 25%, the aggregate demand, it has a big effect on aggregate demand. Now, what if the aggregate demand increases by 15%? What happens to the inflation? Goes up. Why, Christine?
Because people will demand more, the demand curve will shift to the right. And
The
it
demand-
pushes the price up. If the supply keeps like this, if the supply is still in the same position.
But will the supply remain the same? No? Why not? No?
Because as the aggregate demand increases, like there will be more supply to there will be more supply to say with the increase in the aggregate demand, and so the prices will increase due to that.
Very good. So suppliers also respond. They're not passive. The government increases expenditure, the supply increases. Now, this is the most important thing. Can the supply increase by 15% suddenly? No. Because the supply always is dependent on physical factors, physical machinery, human capital, technological learning. And these factors cannot increase by 15% overnight. Spending can increase by 15% overnight. The government just increases spending, but not supply. The highest growing economies, let's say if you're a miracle economy, you're growing by 8% supply. Now the difference, 7%, is inflation. Demand increases, but the supply cannot increase as much, therefore you have inflation. Yes?
Can you also argue that it can be worse?
Could you speak a little bit louder, please?
Can you also argue that it can be worse with the multiplier effect? Because the 25% public spending may lead to more than 50%.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, but let's even simplify it. 50. The idea for you is to understand the supply, that spending can increase overnight by 40%, by 50%, but supply cannot increase overnight. Okay? So basically, here's the story. If the oil prices goes up, and the government decide, the revenue of the government goes up, and the government spends the newfound money, you're going to have trouble, inflation in the economy. So you increase your spending, the government increases the budget, it creates economic boom, the supply increases, but inflation. Now, imagine that oil prices suddenly drop. The government has to reduce suddenly its expenditures. If the oil prices drop by 15%, the government has to reduce its expenditure, and it gives you the exact opposite effect. You have an economic bust. So the big picture is that your economy becomes very volatile. During the good times, you have inflation, a lot of economic activity. During the bad times, you have a sudden swings downward. A lot of upward and downward, a lot of volatility in your economy. So in a way, your economy, the average total, follows the trend of the prices. Now, let's look at the exact thing in the case of Nigeria. This shows you the oil revenues, and these bars are the expenditures, total expenditures. Capital expenditures and recurrent expenditures. This is basically consumption of the government. This is investment of the government. Government building schools, ports, roads. This is just consuming goods, right? Giving salaries to its workers, giving lunch to its workers, okay? As you can see, there is a close connection. As oil prices goes up, the government increases its spending, and oil prices go down, the oil revenues go down, the government decreases spending. A perfect relationship. A lot of ups and downs. What is the effect of this? A very volatile economic growth rate. Lots of ups and downs. Just compare the growth rate of Nigeria to other countries, India, Brazil, and Korea. This is just to show you that the magnitude of volatility in Nigerian case. Now, why volatility is bad anyway? Any idea? Yes?
If you know what your main income stream becomes really volatile, you'll have a reluctancy to spend on long-term infrastructure projects because you don't know if you can continually fund that over the next 10 years.
Yeah,
So you spend on something that won't give you a sustainable development plan. When you do have the money, you don't spend on something sustainable because you can't guarantee that you can afford it for the next 10 to 20 years.
Yeah. Basically, it creates uncertainty. When you have uncertainty, you cannot plan for the future. If you're a government or if you're a private sector. Exactly. Mary. Haja. So, it creates a lot of uncertainty. And this is bad for private investment and also public investment. You cannot plan. An essential part of capitalism is that you have to be able to plan. right? Because without planning, without certainty, the investment is jeopardized. And without investment, without capital accumulation, capitalism cannot function. Now, how can you avoid this problem? Is this problem unavoidable? Yes, Maggie?
You just save some money when you have the oil prices goes up. So when the oil prices go down, you have those money that you can invest to not have like a huge inflation.
Yeah. First of all, don't spend the money. It's very easy. Don't spend the money. Save it. If your government, save it. But where? What happens if you save it domestically? To your domestic bank? Any idea if you can raise it half? Louis?
The banks then loan it out, it still gets spent.
Yeah, they spend it on your behalf. In a way. You don't spend it, you give it to the banks, they spend it. They invest in businesses, they give loans. So the money, again, creeps up as the old aggregate demand indirectly. Therefore, you need to, yes, Muhammad, yes?
Does you have the state, like state development?
Yeah.
Would that still be the case?
What does it do, the state development?
It lends out money, but will it not lend out money in the interest of the state?
In the,
In the interest of the state.
okay, but it lends out in the end of the day anyway. So the money gets into the domestic economy anyway. So as long as this money somehow finds its way to the domestic economy, you're going to have the same problem, inflation. If the government spends it, if the bank spends it, if anyone spends it. Okay? So this is why you have to save it abroad. You have to save it abroad. Exactly what Chinese actually doing with their saved money. They're not spending their savings domestically, they're saving it abroad. Therefore, you have money for bad times. If oil prices go down, you go to your savings and spend it. So, in a way, you minimize the negative effects. During the good times, you don't overspend. Therefore, you avoid inflation, instability. During the bad times, you go back to your savings and increase, and you avoid an economic downturn. So, in a way, you create a buffer against volatility. That's the golden rule of any finance minister. Save during the good times, spend the savings during the bad times. Exact opposite of what Labour government did here in the 2000s. Right? During the boom times, the government had a fiscal deficit. Yes?
Isn't it exactly the same what Ireland is doing all the time? They're
Ireland?
they're always spending when they have like lost money, whenever they're booming.
Well, I'm not sure about Ireland, to be honest with you, but we'll come to other countries. Nigeria is a typical case. Most sub-Saharan Africa, they're terrible savers. We'll come to that in a moment. Now, if you look at the main oil savers in the economy, UAE, Norway, this is amazing. Norway has about $500 billion in spending. So basically, for the next 3 generations, Norwegians don't have to work. Honestly, they don't have to work. Because with the income of these savings, the government can just give them money. They don't have to work. UAE, Qatar, who is funding Al Jazeera? These guys. Out of what money? Oil savings, right? Libya, Algeria. Okay, and you see, these are oil. We call them sovereign wealth fund. It's a fund that you save your money for the rainy day. Sovereign wealth fund, and this gives you a lot of geopolitical influence. You have a lot of savings. In the U.S., Citibank goes down. You have a financial crisis. George Bush gives a call to the UAE and says, save my money, and then, we give you this military deal. Save your, you spend some of your savings in my economy. Yes?
For the case of Libya,
Yeah.
they save their money internationally, but when they went to get access, that money was already loaned out by the banks they saved them in. So isn't that kind of a drawback to gold?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to be very kind to the U.S. because, you're saving your monies abroad, okay? And if they sanction you, they freeze your assets. Exact thing that happened to Iran, you know? And so instead we decide to spend all of our money domestically. And not in machinery, a lot of consumer goods. You know, we bought a lot of cars. We had to enjoy ourselves, right? Right? You sell your wealth on the ground instead of, you know, building assets over ground. You just spend it. It's like that you inherit a good house from your parents and you sell the house and you consume it every day, right? You don't invest it, you just consume it. Okay, so the second problem. We covered the first problem. Yes,
When they save money, do they invest, or do they try keeping it as liquid as possible?
some of it, yes, some of it not. Think of it. You know, you're always. I'm not sure whether I could go into this. Anyway, I'll risk it. I was reading Saudi's documents in the 1970s. So when the oil price was going up, they became Saudi the richest, family on the planet. And U.S. had a lot of fiscal deficit, and they came to the Saudis and they made a big deal. They said, invest your money in our treasury bills and the government bills. We're in a deficit, and then we will protect you militarily. So in a way, government savings does not act like an investment bank. Investment bank only tries to maximize profit. So you diversify into some liquid assets and illiquid assets. But thinking as a government, you're not always maximizing your profit. You also have political objectives as well. So sometimes you invest in things that don't make economic sense, but they make political sense. Okay, the second way that the oil can ruin your economy directly. We call this the Dutch disease channel. The Dutch disease channel. Now, how does this work? This is a little bit tricky. When the oil prices go down, up, I'm Nigerian government, I'm selling oil. I always sell oil in dollars or foreign exchange. I export, I get foreign exchange. Now I want to spend this money domestically, okay? So therefore I need to convert all my dollars into domestic currency in order to spend it, okay? Now what if I want to do this? Convert all my dollars into domestic currency. What happens to the value of domestic currency? Quick raise of hands, please. Maggie?
It goes up, so like all the export goes up as well, so like they would buy less.
No, let's wait. Why it goes up? Why the value of domestic currency goes up? Yes?
Does it increase the demand for it?
Sorry?
Does it increase the demand for it?
No. The other way around. Increase of supply of foreign currency. Okay? So imagine that we have a government coming over with lots of supply of foreign exchange in the market. And I want to sell it to you as citizens, okay? I want to sell my dollars to you, get domestic currency, and then spend it. So what happens in the market? In the market, suddenly the supply of foreign exchange goes up, okay? And the supply of domestic currency remains the same. What happens? Domestic currency appreciates. So, before the oil price boom, you had demand for foreign currency and supply of foreign currency. This suddenly goes up. Therefore, the value of the domestic currencies will go up relative to this. Appreciation of the exchange rate. Now, after the boom, it's a lot less easier, think about it, to buy foreign exchange, because there's much more foreign exchange around in the market. It's not scarce anymore. Okay? Now, what happens to your export? Of course, when the exchange rate appreciates, it hurts your export. You lose your competitiveness globally. Your industries cannot export. There's another side of that. The import price, you cannot compete with imports. The imports will become cheaper. So your domestic currencies are not able to compete with cheap imports. They cannot export and they cannot compete with cheap imports. Therefore, they go bankrupt. You have deindustrialization. Oil prices goes up, the government sells the dollars, the value of domestic currency goes up, or in the other way, the value of the dollar relative to domestic currency goes down. It hits the export sector. Any questions? Now let's look at this in the case of Nigeria. Nigeria shows you that during the time you had a problem of manufacturing here. The Nigerian firms producing way lower than their capacity. This means that they were not very competitive. Nigerian manufacturing sector was not very competitive. And you could see the effect of this relative deindustrialization. Other sectors are becoming more and more important, especially the government, okay, the service sector, but manufacturing has not been increasing relative to the other sectors. This gives you the share of each sectors, okay? Manufacturing has been around 10%. A classic example of deindustrialization. You have oil price booms, exchange rate appreciation, a lot of cheap imports, your industries cannot compete. Now, question, is this unavoidable? Yes?
Print more money.
Sorry?
Print more money.
Print more money. Okay, very good. So, in order to counteract the effect of exchange rate appreciation, I print more domestic money. Yes? I increase the supply of domestic money as much as this. I print money. What happens? What happens? Sorry?
Hyperinflation.
High inflation. What happens to the competitiveness of your industry? Because the domestic inflation goes up, the cost of production goes up. Again, you cannot compete globally. Therefore, even if you do this, you have inflation and still your competitiveness erodes. Your domestic industries are facing increasing costs because of increasing inflation. They cannot compete with cheaper imports. They cannot export their goods. So it doesn't matter whether you go for fixed exchange rate or floating exchange rate. As long as you spend the money domestically, you have this problem. How do you solve it? Again, save the money abroad. Don't spend it. In this way, you avoid the currency appreciation. Save the money abroad. And at the same time, follow industrial policy. Actively encourage diversification in the economy, away from commodity and oil prices. Save the money abroad and actively encourage diversification. Here, you not only avoid deindustrialization, you actually encourage industrialization. You actually encourage diversification. Any questions? Yes?
Let's say if you're a country with very high poverty rates and you don't have the money to save.
With high, sorry?
Poverty rates.
Poverty rates, yes.
And
yes.
if you don't have money to save during booms, what are you supposed to do then?
If you don't have money, it's the same thing. If you are a poor country, that means that if you increase your spending, your supply cannot react immediately. You still have inflation. So you're still better off saving. And remember, inflation always hurts the poor more. Always hurts the poor more. So this goes back to the politics of it. Imagine a poor country that is rich in oil. The oil prices goes up. It's very difficult to sell this policy politically. It's very difficult to come over to your people and say, look, it is better for all of us that we don't spend this money. On the other hand, a politician comes up, your competitor, and says, no, they want to steal the money. We have to spend it. We have to give it to people. And who usually people vote for? The second person. Chavez is the best example of it. Chavez, a lot of oil boom, he said, I'm going to spend all of it. I'm going to bring the oil revenue to the people's dinner table. Ahmadinejad, Iran's president, said the exact same thing. When 2005 the price of oil went up, he said, I'm going to distribute the oil revenues to you. And people loved it and voted for him. Okay, we'll come to politics in a moment, okay? So, you can avoid the Dutch disease. By the way, what we call this Dutch disease, surprise, surprise, first one happened in the Netherlands. In the 1970s, Netherlands discovered a lot of natural gas, and they started to spend that natural gas domestically, and their currency appreciated, and the economy started to deindustrialize. So this is why we call this Dutch disease. How to avoid it, save the money abroad, and actively diversify. Let's go for the final channel. We cover this and we will have a break. The final channel is state overstretch. Remember that oil revenues are, oil industries throughout the world are mostly nationalized. The revenue that is derived from selling oil directly goes to the government. And this gives the temptation to government to expand. Right? They find a lot of money, they spend, the public expenditure starts to grow and grow. Okay? Not only you don't limit yourself to classic functions of government, minimal government, like you build roads, provide defense, You start to do a lot of things. You come up with, you act like a business. You start to produce cars, you start to produce steel, you become a big conglomerate. Why is that bad? You basically reduce the room for private investment, for the private sector. You start to enter in every industry. You don't act as a minimal government. You crowd out the private investment, and usually, we're going to see this, in most oil-rich countries, the private sector is very weak. When you have a weak private sector, you have a problem of employment. Think about Arab Spring countries, a classic example. Overstretched states. The states become lender of last resort. Now you have a lot of young people coming to the labor market. The state cannot absorb them, and you have a weak private sector. The private sector is weak, it cannot create jobs. Therefore, you have high unemployment rate. Then you get Arab Spring, Arab winter. I don't know what to call it anymore. Anyway. Now, this is the classic case that you see the Nigerian government becoming bigger and bigger over time. The oil revenues goes up. This gives you the government revenues in dollars, going up from 5 billion to 20 billion. Here is the importance of these revenues to the total economy, to the relative size of the economy. Still been growing. Another graph, this actually captures the argument beautifully. It compares for each region oil-rich states to non-oil-rich states. Okay? And this gives you the percentage of government revenue as total GDP. You see that oil-rich states are bigger, are stretched. They spend a lot comparing to resource-poor states. Usually, oil-rich states kind of act as employer of last resort. They are the main source of job creation in the economy. Now, can you avoid this? Is this unavoidable? Is this unavoidable? Any idea? Well, yeah. Again, you can save the oil revenues, not to spend it. You don't have to spend it, because if the oil revenues goes up, you're not forced to spend it and overstretch yourself. You can save the money. And in this way, you leave a lot of room for private investment in the economy, for private sector to grow. You don't limit the space for private sector. You actually crowd in private sector. Any questions? Before going to the break, let me do a wrap-up. Okay? Economic explanation. We covered 3 ways that oil can ruin your economy directly. Through its volatility, okay? Through exchange rate appreciation, the oil prices goes up, the exchange rate goes up, your economy deindustrializes. And finally, the oil prices goes up, the state becomes very, very big, and then the private sector remains weak. However, we mentioned that all of these problems are easily avoidable. You can fix them. You just need to make sure that you save the oil revenues abroad when the oil prices goes up. You actively diversify your economy to industrial policy, and you let the private sector to flourish. If you do these things, then the oil can become a blessing. You avoid all these problems. However, yes?
It doesn't have encouraging industrial growth require spending some of the oil revenue on in your
Absolutely. You need to spend some of it here, right? But again, you need to save a chunk of it. I'm not saying that you save all of it. You need to spend some of it for industrial policy and diversification. Okay, but don't get carried away. Don't increase your spending by 40% because your economy cannot grow by 40%. So, here's the main thing. This can be easily fixed, right? Tomorrow, an oil-rich country can, ask Jacob for advice, and you tell them, if the oil prices goes up, don't spend it, save it. The problem easily solved. Now, here's the question: if this problem can be easily solved in the way that I mentioned, why a lot of countries that have oil are in trouble? If getting out of oil curse is so easy, then you need to just save your oil monies abroad and follow these policy prescriptions. Why so many countries are not following them? Yes?
Because of political reasons.
Because of political reasons. After the break. Thank you. For current expenditures. For day-to-day running of the state. So that is the, like your, for current expenditures, you get taxed daily. But for the long-term expenditure, you use the oil. That is the perfect start. You don't think about the other way. Do you want to use the oil for day-to-day expenditures? Like the analogy, you sell your house, it's a wealth unto you. You spend it on day-to-day consumption? No. You want to turn the wealth underground into wealth overground, into schools, into roads, into something that generates income in the future. You don't want to consume it immediately. So for day-to-day expenditures, you get taxed. For investment, you use the wealth.
But it's still getting taxed ridiculously high. I think they get taxed something like 40-50%. Yeah. But I know, especially like Sweden, Norway, that area, they know the tax a lot. Yeah. But still, I thought if they had reserves, then
maybe it's because of redistribution. You just tax in order to make sure that you get from the rich and give it to the poor, therefore income inequality does not increase.
One other thing or two.
Yeah.
Today is the last time you're.
Second term is given by non-man.
And then third term is just exam.
Oh yeah. I will. No, I know. I will allocate you. Give me some time. Okay. Thanks. Yeah.
So there's a way you can avoid this talking about. There's a way you can avoid hyperinflation, like for example, biofortification. Now with your hyperinflation, we're getting the supply of your domestic goods. So say that we're reducing the supply of goods
And you're competitive.
So what does
You want to fix the knowledge. The supply of farmers. You want to keep it.
that way sort of has a low value.
Now you want to avoid capital. Yeah. Your currency. How do you avoid that?
What currency is it?
With what?
In exchange for your own currency.
Yeah, so you have to
Okay, so that's the
the supply of currency needs to supply in order to keep the balance the same. Nominal exchange rate remains the same. What happens? You got so in nominal yield terms, we have
what do you mean by diversification? What do you mean by diversification?
going from low labor
On the way here, because I've worn some
Now, before, let me explain the Dutch disease once more again, because we had a question here. Imagine a currency market, every currency market, right? Imagine here that we're in India. You have dollars, and these guys have rupees. You want to exchange it with each other. You want to get the dollars, and these guys want to get your rupee, right? You bargain with each other. We have a rate. Every dollar is exchanged with 100 rupees. You get $1 to them, you get 100 rupees. Okay? Now, imagine that I'm a government, and the oil prices goes up. I come to the market with lots of dollars. What happens to the bargaining power?
Wait, go with lots of dollars.
Sorry?
What's the question? Sorry.
What happens to our bargaining power with them? Sorry?
It increases. You have more dollars to offer.
It decreases because our dollars are too expensive.
No, we have a lot of dollars, not scarce as before, like every other market, right? There are a lot more dollars around, so you have the bargaining power because the number of buyers haven't changed, but then you have a sudden big government with lots of dollars coming in, wants to sell it, okay? Therefore, the price of dollar goes down. Now, we have to exchange every dollar with 90 rupees. Or, yes?
So in general, exchange rates are just based on the bargaining power between nations, right?
No, the domestic markets, the rupiah, how does it? They have a domestic market in India. Some people have dollars, some people have domestic currency. They want to exchange it with each other. That gives you the currency rate. Now, in most of the developing countries, the government intervenes. Right? It acts as either a buyer or a seller, right, to get the rate that it wants. Now, here is that suddenly the oil prices go up, you have a lot of revenue, your bargaining power decreases, therefore $1 buys 1 rupiah. That means the rupiah has become stronger relative to the dollar now. The value of rupiah has gone up, exchange rate appreciation. Now let's move on. Now, if the resource curse can be avoided so easily, why we still have problems, right? Why so many oil-rich countries, cannot avoid these things? Is it that they don't have the good expert from SOAS to tell them? Is it that they cannot, get consultancy from me? I tell them, you need to save your monies abroad. No, it's political. Oil changes the political incentives. It's not about technical problems. This is not a technical problem that can be fixed technically. You give them this is policy A is the answer. No. It's a political problem. And here we have two explanations for how oil can hurt your economy. These are indirect explanations. The explanations say that oil corrupts your politics and then negatively affects your economy. So it's an indirect channel. Oil corrupts your politics and then hurts your economy indirectly. And we have two different explanations for that. Rentier-state theory and the Civil War effect. Let's start with rentier-state theory, which is my favorite. This theory says that oil corrupts the nature of your states and leads to bad policy making. Oil corrupts the character of your state. it turns your state into a rentier state. And I'm going to explain what I mean by rentier state. What are the rentier states? They have access to external income. Income dropped from the sky. Natural resources. You happen to have good natural resources, you sell your natural resources, and all the money comes to you. It's unearned income, something that you just inherited. A natural wealth that you had inherited, you sell it and you gain money. It's like a house that you inherited, you sell it, you gain money. We call this rent, unearned income. You haven't done anything productive about it. The only productive thing that you do about it is the extraction. The analogy with the house is that you renovate the house that you inherited and you sell it. The only productive thing you've done is the renovation. The rest, you haven't done anything. It's unearned income. This graph shows you the cost of extraction of each dollar of oil barrel for these countries. You can see for Saudi Arabia is below $5. Now, they could sell that barrel of oil for $80, for instance. A large difference. It's very easy for them to extract oil and they can sell the oil at a higher price. The difference is the rent, unearned income. Now, this is the most important thing. When you have access to external revenues, you become highly dependent on them. They become the main source of the state funds. You can see the importance of oil revenues here as a percentage of total revenues in Nigeria. The Nigeria state gets about 80% of its total revenues from oil. A state gets 80% of its total revenue from one source. What does it tell you? This. Little reliance on tax. You don't need to tax. You're just getting 20% in tax. The rest of 80% of your revenues are coming from oil. Here's the most important thing. You become financially independent from the society that you're governing. You're not depending on them. Right? In here, the government depends on the citizen to run its daily activities. You have to get taxed, and then you spend tax. But when you have oil, you don't need to get taxed. You don't need to get into bargaining relationship with your citizens. This is why the most important thing about rentier state is that they're financially independent from their societies. Now, what is the main effect of this? The citizens lose their bargaining power over the state. You have dictatorships. The state does not have an incentive to be accountable to its citizens. You don't give me tax, why do I have to be accountable to you? I have my own money. I could build a very good police force and suppress you. I'm not depending on you. So basically, the citizens cannot force the government to be accountable to them. The citizens cannot force the government to build a good public administration to give them service. They cannot influence the state to provide them with good education, good healthcare, good infrastructure, accountability in their financial matters, accountability in political matters. So therefore, rentier states tend to be dictatorships. And they tend to have weak states. They tend to be weak states. Weak public administration, weak rule of law. This is how oil and other natural resources corrupts the nature of states. This is the golden rule in politics. No representation without taxation. If you're not depending on taxes, you don't have an incentive to be accountable to you. People, this is what's actually the slogan of the American Revolution. The American Revolution has said, why do we have to pay tax to the Queen and then we don't have a say, we don't have a vote in the UK's affair? Therefore, they revolted. Okay, we want representation because we pay tax. Now, in oil-producing countries, this does not hold. They're not represented because they don't pay taxes. And you see that oil producers, this is the rank of democracy. Oil producers tend to be less democratic than non-oil producer countries. Think about Arab Spring. It did not succeed. People could not overthrow governments that were rich in natural resources. Citizens were not able to overthrow governments that were rich in natural resources. So those dictatorships survived. As Edmund Burke says, revenue is the chief preoccupation of the state. Without that, the state does not actually mean anything. How many of you know Edmund Burke? Okay. Father of modern conservatism. Now, what is the effect of this? So, it corrupts your state. How does your state react? First of all, the state becomes a distributor. Okay, it doesn't become a developmental state. You only focus on one thing, right? I'm going to buy loyalty from my citizens. You know, I'm going to distribute my oil revenues to people and get their loyalty and consent in return. Just remember what happened during the protests in Gulf countries. You know, Gulf countries suddenly started to give a lot of money to their citizens. You know, go spend a vacation with your family. You're tired. Okay, you need a good vacation. And they increase the spending. Okay. Instead of promoting economic growth. These states do not need to promote economic growth because they don't rely on taxes. It's not China that you need to increase growth and therefore that growth increases your tax base. You don't need that, right? You don't have an incentive for promoting growth. Your only incentive is to distribute, you know, the resources you have and buy loyalty. Transfer of your resources to loyal classes. And finally, the private sector becomes the same thing. Private sector, it just becomes a loyal class. Again, because you don't have an incentive to promote growth, you don't have an incentive for private sector promotion, okay? So private sector, in a way, becomes dependent on you, rather than you being dependent on private sector for creating jobs and tax revenues for you. It becomes completely the other way around. The private sector becomes dependent on your favors rather than you being dependent on private sector for employment generation and tax revenues. So in a way, let me summarize this. The rentier states do not become distribution states. They don't become developmental states, they become distribution states. They don't have an incentive to promote economic growth. And also, they tend to be dictatorial. They don't have an incentive to improve their accountability there. When you don't have an incentive to promote growth, of course, you have bad policymaking. So then again, oil corrupts the incentives of growth. Now, how can you avoid this effect? Any idea? Yes?
To use your rents to innovate your private sector so they economically diversify.
Yes.
So in terms of a bus, you've got a reliable private state that's either
Okay. Okay, very good. Very good, thank you. That you say that if you have a long-term horizon, you build a good private sector because it can help you during the troubled times. Now what's the incentive problem for that? Yes?
I'm rich, why should I? Essentially, the government's made so much money from oil that they've just become an oil distributor, and the private sector depends on them.
Okay.
So,
now let's say that you are a very long dictator with a very long-term horizon. You say maybe in the future oil prices go down and we get into trouble. Therefore, we need a good private sector. Is this enough for you to promote private sector? No. The main issue is that when you promote private sector, you reduce your own political power because in time, a social class will become influential. That is the main worry. That is the main risk that you take. That you support a class, like the case in South Korea, remember? You support a business class, and in the long term, this business class grows and grows, and one day they become very powerful. So in a way, the calculation that you make is that do I need a powerful class outside the state in the long term? Basically, here's the problem. You cannot avoid this problem. If the oil occurs to the state, what can citizens do? The oil-rich state becomes automatically independent from its citizens. So in a way, according to this theory, oil-rich countries are destined to remain poor. Because the oil corrupts their state, and you have bad policy making. And the citizens have no power over the states. Any questions? Now, the second effect, I'm going to jump this very, very quickly. You heard about this, that natural resources breed civil war conflicts. The idea is that when the oil prices go up, when you have a poor country, basically the cost of rebellion for people is not very high. If you're poor, you got not much to lose. So, which is mainly the case in sub-Saharan African countries. You have natural resource states, the population is poor, the population does not have much more to lose. So basically, the cost of rebellion for people is very low. And when you have oil prices, you have a lot of civil war. Just think about Syria today. Exactly. What is breeding conflict? It's all about oil. All about oil. Daesh controlling the oil fields. That is their main, basically, main source of revenues. So we actually have a living example of this, oil breeding civil conflicts in Syria as we speak. And the UK is trying to attack the oil fields in Syria. Now, if you look at it, this actually gives you the conflict rate between oil producers and non-oil producers. Oil producers and non-oil producers. And you say, in the case of low-income countries, you have a number of conflicts in oil producers than the non-oil producers here. However, final part of the lecture. Let's finish the whole course on a little bit optimistic tone. Okay? Let's look at the evidence again from the beginning. This graph tells you that yes, Nigeria had been in trouble, but during the past decades, it has been growing. This tells you maybe oil is not destiny. Okay, sometimes countries can break away from the oil curse. Maybe. So oil is not always a curse. It has been bad for Nigeria during the last 6 decades, but recently it has been good. Just focus on this part. It's the income per capita, again, Nigeria, drastically increasing after 2000. Having the oil, but having a very high economic growth. Okay? If we look at the highest growing economies in the last 15 years, we see Angola growing by 11%. Oil-rich country. Nigeria, an oil-rich country. Chad, an oil-rich country. Okay? So recently, we see a little evidence for the curse. So, natural resources may not always be a curse. The final point. Let's take a look at the chart. Let's take a look at it again. What is the problem in here? Let's take here, compare countries with the same amount of resources. Compare their growth rate. Let's hold this constant. Compare their growth rate. What do you see? Anyone? Luke?
I was going to say most of the growth is quite high, but
Let's keep this amount of natural resources high and focus on the growth rate of countries. What do we see? A lot of variability. There's a lot of diversity. Some countries are above the line, some countries are down the line. That tells you that there's a lot of diversity within the resource-rich countries. For every bad case, like Nigeria, you have a good case. Botswana, rich in diamonds but growing. For every Nigeria, you have an Indonesia, an oil-rich country that has been grown. For every Nigeria, you had a Malaysia. However, this graph only shows the average effects. It averages out all these things. It doesn't take into account the diversity above and below the line. The line just averages these. There's a lot of diversity. So, oil is not everywhere a curse. We have many resource-rich countries that have been able to escape the curse. It's not always the curse. The good example is Nigeria and Indonesia. Both oil-rich, both resource-rich. In the 60s, Indonesia was much less poor than Nigeria. Now, look at their growth rate. A complete divergence between two countries that had the same level of resources. This tells you that resources and oil are not destiny. Some countries can break away from them. So therefore, here's the main question. Under what conditions oil becomes a curse? And under what condition can you escape the curse? Why is it that Indonesia managed to escape the oil curse, but Nigeria failed to do so? And we're going to talk about this during the tutorial. Now let me give you a summary of the lecture. We can think of Nigeria as a tragedy, a country that was rich with oil but have wasted its opportunities, comparing to other countries. We can think of oil as the main reason that Nigeria has not been able to grow. Remember that oil not only can ruin your economy directly, but it can ruin your politics. We had economic explanations for the curse. Oil can ruin your economy directly. However, we mentioned that these problems are not unavoidable. You can easily fix them. Then, we mentioned that we had political explanations, that oil corrupts your politics and then ruins your economy. However, we mentioned that oil is not always or everywhere a curse. We had so many countries in history that have managed to escape the resource curse. Again, think of Canada, New Zealand, US. They've all been resource-rich countries, but they developed. Okay. Now, the main thing we need to answer in our tutorial is that on what condition oil becomes a curse. Now, wait. Don't want to get emotional, okay? This was my last lecture. I enjoyed every single lecture, to be honest with you. I really appreciate your effort and the enthusiasm. Remember, we're halfway there. We've got another term ahead of us. I want to see the same level of enthusiasm and dedication and discipline. Okay? Now, in the second term, in the end of the second term, you'll be filling out the feedback. Okay? I know you're all humans. You might, completely forget about me. By that time, things may change. However, I have only one request. At the end of the second term, when you're filling out the feedback for this course, you have a comment section. Please leave a comment. If it's bad or good, leave a comment. Say, we hated Ramin. We just leave a comment. Other than that, I would like to thank you. This has been one of the most pleasurable experiences of my life. Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you. We'll do a session. We'll do a beginning session. Can you talk about it later? Yeah, you can come over to my office hours. Yeah? Yeah. I'll appreciate it.
So far, one of the best professors.
Yeah, hopefully. We're halfway there. Remember, this is halfway. Take care. Thumbs up. I'll see you at Wednesday. Until then. What happens next term? Hey, Owen. You're right. Yeah, what happens next term? Still the character growth? Yeah. It's someone else. These are my favourite lectures so far. Thank you. Thank you. I'll see you about. Hey, adios. Yeah? Pleasure. Pleasure.
Try to find contact emails for next term.
Yeah.
There's lots more.
It's in the course now. I put it in the course now.
It's been put in the course.
Yeah. Hey, Hadi. Yeah. Sorry. I don't do it. They faculty do it.
Most of it is breakfast. So they take that into account.
To be honest with you, faculty.
My favorite lecture, but so you know.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you, guys. Pleasure.
So, do you have with your office hours still with the same?
Yeah. I'm not sure about the second time. Because I have a different time zone. Yeah.
Okay.
It might be. I'll let you know. I think take care. Bye. Bye. I have to. They put it online. They update it. But anyway, you can just send me an email. Say what's your office hours.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, sir. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.